All right, so I just finished watching the conversation between Gavin Ortlund and Father Gregory Pine, and I mean literally just finished watching it. And I have to say, I really enjoyed it. Like, I thought it was thoughtful. I thought it was very charitable. And honestly, I think Father Pine is actually one of the more candid Catholic voices that I've heard on some of these issues in a very, very long time whenever I come to think about it. Now, whether or not I agree with him is an entirely different question. But I at least appreciate when people are willing to just, lay their cards out on the table and explain how they're actually arriving at their conclusions, right? I love it when we can just do that. And honestly, I think we need to do more of that in these conversations. And so as I would continue watching this interview, which, by the way, I will have linked in the description below, there were two specific moments in the conversation that really stood out to me. Not because, I think they somehow refuted Catholicism all by themselves, and not because I think Father Pine accidentally undermined his own position. I don't think any one of those things. Rather, I think these two moments help, explain why Catholics and Protestants, more specifically, so often just continue to talk past one another. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that I think they get us right down to the very heartbeat of some of our deepest deepest disagreements. And so let's start with the first moment that I would like to respond to.
And I think that leads to probably the deeper issue, which I also want to ask you about, is because I don't see that root there in divine revelation in the New Testament. So maybe we can come back to that. But first on this point of just, we've got differing visions of ecclesiology, which is the doctrine of the church. And so let me pause there and see if you want to interact with that at all. And then we can come to maybe the question of how do we parse out the accretions from the valid growths of what God birthed in infant form and then is growing versus the things that come along. Because I use the word accretions to refer to that which is growing gradually, but it is an innovation. Yeah. It doesn't have a foundation in divine revelation. But I'm sensitive to not talk too long if you want to jump in at any point here. So, let's talk about that then. So we've identified some differences in terms of Catholicity and our vision of the church. How do you think through, and I've read John Henry Newman on this, and I've listened to Shaban and other Catholic dogmaticians on this, the difference between the valid developments and the invalid. I think we can all admit things can go awry. Yeah. A growth can come in and start to get into the mix, and it's not of God. It's not a genuine, organic outgrowth from something God revealed. Mm-hmm. That would be, if I had in a nutshell to kind of boil down to, this is why I'm not Catholic. And it would be a similar answer for not being Orthodox, is there's a lot of things that are required. You mentioned the 7 sacraments, for example, that there's the number 7, that I don't believe go back to what the apostles could have recognized. I don't think it is a valid development. In your own thinking, how do you distinguish between valid outgrowth from divine revelation? Because I think we agree there's something that changes when the apostles die. The New Testament, even though it still needs to be discerned, is no longer being written. Yeah. And to use your church's language, the era of public revelation comes to a close. Yep. That's a significant closure, and we all want to be faithful to that. Yep. A lot of the things that are required in Catholic theology, I see as not just like a little bit off. I see as way later. 7 sacraments would be one. Some aspects of Mariology would be another. How do you think through valid, invalid, doctrinal development versus accretions? How do you think that through?
Yeah. I'd say broad brushstrokes would be, we can differentiate between the order of discovery and the order of being. So in the sense that there's a particular way that one would come to a belief or come to a confession of these things, and then there's a particular way that one would come to defend them, which I think, while not in conflict, are different kinds of approaches. So, one definition of tradition from St. Vincent of Lerins is just what the church has taught always and everywhere. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense that I believe what the church teaches now, and I retroject what she teaches now into the past. That's just epistemologically, that's how I come to it. And so then I can give an account of that apologetically, but epistemically or epistemologically, I kind of come to a recognition of it by virtue of what the church proposes for belief at present. And I can recognize that it's more or less detailed or it's more or less refined in its formulation by comparison to past generations, typically more. But just organically, I believe what the church teaches to be held with divine and Catholic faith.
Now, I actually want you to pay very, very close attention to what Father Pine is actually saying in that clip, because I actually think it's one of the most illuminating moments in the entire interview. Father Pine says specifically, and quote, "I believe what the church teaches now, and I retroject what she teaches now into the past." Now, I can't stress enough how much I just appreciate that honesty from Father Pine there, because a lot of times what I've actually noticed is that many Catholics are simply afraid to just admit and say what he just said there, right? And just to make sure that we're not misunderstanding him, he's not saying that church history, for example, doesn't matter whenever you're evaluating the historical claims of Rome, right? He's not saying that the church fathers doesn't matter or that doctrinal development doesn't matter when evaluating the historical claims of Rome. Rather, what he's simply saying is that the ultimate reason why he believes these doctrines are true in the first place is because he first trusts the authority of the Catholic Church. And then what he then does is goes back into history to help him, maybe explain and understand and even defend those doctrines, right? That's exactly what he's saying here. And again, I appreciate that candor because I think it's a concession that so many Catholics would actually resonate with. It seems like this is what many of you actually believe. And, so that he's not alone, I actually want to make a concession myself. You see, if the Roman Catholic claim were true, if Christ or the apostles actually promised that future bishops would be able to teach infallibly, then I actually think Father Pine's approach here would actually make a ton of sense. I know, shocking for a Protestant to admit that. And let me, expound on what I mean there. You see, I want you to imagine that you have a math textbook, and in the back of that math textbook is the answer key. The coveted answer key that every student wants to get a hold of to basically breeze through class. Now, I want you to imagine someone hands you a homework assignment where portions of the work have been, erased, right? Some of the steps are visible, some of them are faded, and some of them are just simply missing altogether. Now, if you know with absolute certainty that the answer key is infallible, then even if the intermediate steps are difficult to reconstruct as you're, filling out your homework assignment, even if portions of the homework assignment are difficult to interpret, you still feel comfort, right? Because you already know what the answer is ultimately supposed to be, what the answer is ultimately supposed to end up as, right? You may debate how the solution got there. You may work through different possibilities with you and your fellow students. You may even disagree about some of the intermediate steps, right? All of that is fine and dandy. But throughout that entire process, one thing that you're never going to be questioning is that you're never going to question the final answer because the answer has already been guaranteed by the answer key. And honestly, I think that's a fair way to, kind of understand not only Father Pine's position here, but also how, so many Catholics are thinking through these issues. Because if Scripture actually taught that Christ established an infallible teaching office that could definitively define doctrine and bind the conscience of believers, then Father Pine's methodology would be entirely reasonable. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that it would probably be the most reasonable approach available to us. And so, just for my Protestant friends, I think this is really helpful for a lot of you because it helps us to understand where so many Catholics are coming from. However, on the flip side, I actually think this is where I can probably help my Catholic friends maybe understand where their fellow Protestants are coming from. You see, Protestants don't believe that Christ or the apostles actually promised this kind of infallible teaching office in the first place. I know, shocker, right? But it has to be stated. Now, I know Catholics will kind of point to places like Matthew chapter 16 and Matthew chapter 18, John chapter 16, and other passages to help establish their case. And we can certainly have those discussions, right? We could debate about those passages until we're blue in the face. We can walk through those texts together and really kind of chomp at the bit at them. But it should still be noted that the Protestant position is that we do not believe that those texts are teaching what Catholics believe they are teaching. Of course, that's where exegesis, sound hermeneutics come into the play because all of that's really important for getting to the heart of what those passages actually say. Again, we can disagree about that. We got that. But that's the actual disagreement, right? The problem is not that Protestants somehow hate church authority, or that we hate church history, or that we deny any type of doctrinal development, right? The disagreement is over whether Christ or the apostles has actually given us the kind of authority structure that Father Pine and so many other Catholics are assuming. And so for my Catholic friends watching this is where you can at least begin to see where we're coming from as Protestants, right? You see, for us, we don't start by asking, what does Rome teach on this or that issue? We start by asking, what did the apostles or Christ himself teach on this or that issue? And of course, the best place to find out the answer to that is the sacred scriptures. That's literally where their words are documented, where their teachings are documented, right? That's the starting place for us. And so if someone were to walk into our church tomorrow and claim that, let's say the Apostle Paul taught a doctrine that had been forgotten for centuries upon centuries, right? Our first response wouldn't be, well, what office do you hold, right? What kind of authority do you hold? That really wouldn't be what we would go to first. Rather, our first response would be, okay, maybe he did, but can you show me the evidence, right? Can you show me where the Apostle Paul documented it or said such a thing, right? Can you show us that? Because especially if you're telling me that I'm bound to believe it upon threat of anathema, because if you can't do that, then I don't want to hear it, right? That's kind of like the Protestant mindset. You see, I think that's really important for us to clarify, because I think so many Catholics assume that Protestants reject these things simply because Rome teaches them, right? As if we're just anti-Catholic. And, it's true that you may still have some Protestants who are anti-Catholic, but the vast majority of them are not anti-Catholic. We're just anti anything that can't be substantiated, by, credible documents, things of that nature. And so it's not necessarily the case that we're anti-Catholic. If someone were to convince us tomorrow that, let's say, the Assumption of Mary, or that the praying of saints, or that icon veneration, or that papal infallibility were all genuinely apostolic, right? We're all genuinely teachings that derive from Christ or the apostles, then we would happily admit that we must believe these things. And so again, the issue is not whether we're willing to accept apostolic teaching. I know so many Catholics think that this is the hang up for many Protestants, but it's not. The issue is whether these claims are actually apostolic in and of themselves. And when you actually think about it, I think part of the reason this disagreement feels so contentious is because Catholics and Protestants tend to assign different roles to church history. Follow me where I'm going here. Because now, before anyone try to misunderstand me, I firmly believe that church history matters, right? I love church history. I have volumes upon volumes of the church fathers sitting on my bookshelf over there. And I think all of them are incredibly valuable, right? You won't believe how many church fathers, right? From John of Damascus to Athanasius to Saint Ignatius, I have so many of them. Maybe I'll do kind of like a bookshelf kind of reveal one of these days if y'all kind of like something like that. But at the same time, while I believe church history can corroborate apostolic teaching, while I believe that church history can support apostolic teaching, while I believe that church history can help us, better understand apostolic teaching, I still, and so many other Protestants, believe that church history by itself cannot prove that something is truly apostolic. And again, I think that's where maybe, Protestants and Catholics will start to diverge, right? And one of the reasons why we believe this is because church history is messy. For instance, take the Arian controversy as an example. If you were tasked with proving the, let's say, deity of Christ using church history alone, so not scriptures, how would you go about doing that? Because you could find plenty of Arians very early on in church history. Now, I know the Council of Nicaea convened, and purportedly settled this issue, and the Trinitarians won the day, and then that was the end. But the problem was that actually wasn't the end. Now, was it? Because eventually the Arians made a comeback, so much so that it was eventually Athanasius against everyone. This is kind of where we get that phrase Athanasius against the whole world, right? That this is it, because everybody in church history basically became on the side of the Arians. And literally it was just Athanasius just kind of like standing on the word of God. And so here's my question to you. How did Athanasius ultimately and eventually prevail in the end? Was it because he had the best poll numbers? No. Was it because he had the largest coalition? No. Was it because he could point to the, most bishops at that particular moment who believed the same thing that he believed? No. It wasn't any of that. He prevailed because he kept returning again and again to sacred scripture. He kept arguing that the Arians were contradicting the apostolic witness that was literally documented and preserved in the very word of God. That's how he prevailed. In other words, my friends, the question for Athanasius wasn't simply who can claim more historical support, who can claim more support from the different bishops around him. The question was, what did the apostles actually teach in the scriptures? He didn't care how many bishops convened in a council. For him, he was like, I'm standing on the word of God. And if what all of y'all are teaching contradicts it, then I'll stand by myself. And my point to so many Catholics and even Orthodox, if you're watching this, is that that's simply the mindset that Protestants have adopted today. Those are the questions that the Protestants are continuing to ask today. Now, I know that example will only go so far for many of my Catholic and Orthodox listeners. And again, I'm not trying to disprove or debunk Catholicism outright in this video. Really, the goal of this video is much, much simpler. The goal is simply to help us push the ball forward in these kind of conversations so that we can actually get to the heart of where our fundamental disagreement lies, my friend, because that's really important. Because I think once we understand where we're actually disagreeing, we can now begin to have a much more productive conversation. And I think Father Pine, perhaps, unintentionally or even intentionally, helped illuminate exactly where that disagreement begins. Now, with all that in mind, I actually want to move on to the second clip because I actually thought this was pretty illuminating too.
But then when giving an apologetic account, I think that a lot can be done by, one, situating the relative importance of a claim, which isn't to say that like some claims aren't important and other claims are important, but I like to differentiate between like primary, secondary, and tertiary revelata, in the sense that you have the articles of the creed, which are proposed for us as principles of belief, in the sense that like these are the most principled things from which other beliefs flow or on which other beliefs hinge. So the two most important we already talked about being the triune God and the incarnate Lord. And so like when St. Thomas, for instance, reads the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, he'll divide it up into articles as is traditionally done. And I'll say there's like 12 or 14 articles, and half of them pertain to the triune God and half of them pertain to the incarnate Lord. And really that's the seedbed of faith. And so then, on the basis of those things, we hold other secondary and tertiary beliefs which hinge from them. But when we set them forward like a kind of litmus test of true belief or a kind of like dog whistle for identifying who's in and who's out, then I actually think it can misrepresent their relative importance. So like the Marian dogmas, for instance, I would take as of secondary and tertiary importance, not because like I don't love the Blessed Virgin Mary, but because the grace of the Incarnation is more principled than the grace of divine maternity. In the sense that like this is what we hold with divine and Catholic faith as primarily revealed, and this is what we hold with divine and Catholic faith as secondarily revealed. So it's like, that then is the primary Marian dogma, the fact of the divine maternity, because it pertains most immediately to the grace of the Incarnation, because it's that in light of which Mary received the peculiar outpouring, the particular outpouring that was bestowed upon her. So I think that like we can do a lot apologetically by enunciating the principles in principled fashion. And then you have to do the work of history, obviously. But I think the work of history will always be, in a certain sense, contingent upon the available data. So it's like when you search the geologic record, you're hoping to find a particular kind of thing at a particular layer of sedimentary rock. But there is the chance that you won't find it there because of the limited scope of your inquiry. So I think that we have to be like conscious of that when it comes to historical study, but I'm talking too long. So.
No, you're not talking too long at all. No.
Now, again, I want to start by saying that I really appreciate Father Pine's candor here. Again, I can't stress that enough. In fact, I think this is yet another area where he says something that many Catholics either don't say enough or perhaps don't emphasize enough. Because I actually want you to notice what he says about the Marian dogmas. You see, he places them in the category of secondary and tertiary doctrines, similar to how Jimmy Akin, in his response to Gavin Ortlund, if you can remember that, regarding icon veneration, he described icon veneration as a tertiary issue.
Okay, second question. Is icon veneration a tertiary issue? Jimmy, early on in the video, this is one of his early comments, he proposed that the theology of icon veneration isn't higher up on he said it's way down on the hierarchy of truths, and so that this is not a good reason to be Protestant, and he was kind of chiding me, suggesting I should know this because I wrote a book on it.
Icon veneration, that's what makes you Protestant rather than Catholic or Orthodox? I mean, in the hierarchy of truths, icon veneration is a tertiary doctrine at best. And Gavin ought to know that, since he's the author of the book Finding the Right Hill to Die On, about how to recognize the weight of different issues. And objectively, icon veneration is way down on the list. It's not a hill to die on. I don't know what other things are holding you back, Gavin, but if what you say is true, then, dude, you're actually really close to becoming Catholic or Orthodox.
Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I'm not saying that Father Pine or Jimmy Akin thinks, Marian dogmas or even icon veneration are unimportant. Neither do I think that either one of these men believe that, these beliefs are simply optional or that Catholics can simply reject them. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I believe they're saying. Rather, what they're saying is that these doctrines are not on the same level as something like the Trinity, right? The incarnation or the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And to be honest, I think this is actually an area where we could actually find some agreement between Protestants and Catholics, because Protestants also believe that the Marian dogmas and icon veneration are nowhere near the same level as the very gospel itself. Now, we may disagree about how much importance these doctrines should have, or whether they should have any importance at all, when you come to think about it. But I think we can at least agree that they are not the gospel. And I think that's an agreement that we should not just kind of brush over. It's really important that we affirm that agreement together. But you see, even though we can acknowledge that agreement, I think this is where we still have a great deal of tension that we have to deal with, that we simply cannot ignore, because the Catholic Church has attached a multitude of anathemas and doctrinal and dogmatic obligations to some of these very beliefs, which kind of changes the conversation for everyone. You see, now this is no longer merely a discussion about, someone's theological opinions. This is no longer merely a discussion about, whether or not icon veneration is Christian liberty or not. Now, this becomes a discussion about what actually constitutes fellowship with the church and ultimately fellowship with Christ himself. Because that's where this all really boils down to when you come to think about it. When the Apostle Paul issues his anathema in Galatians chapter 1, he doesn't attach it to just any and every disagreement. He attaches it specifically to the gospel itself. And so the bar, as you can see, is set very high. The principle is that the issue must be gospel related if you are going to anathematize somebody from the church. And just as a point of clarification, Protestants absolutely believe that we can or even should anathematize people today. I know that's often a point of confusion among many Catholics and brothers and sisters, but it's true. If someone denies the Trinity, that matters. If someone denies the deity of Christ, that matters. If someone preaches a different gospel, that matters. If someone undermines the very message by which sinners are saved, my friends, that matters. And so we're not against drawing hard lines. We're not against protecting the gospel. Rather, what we are actually against is misplacing anathemas or attaching first order consequences to doctrines that are simply not first order in nature. And I think many of our Catholic and even Orthodox listeners could probably appreciate where Protestants are coming from here. And this is where, as Protestants, we would respectfully protest the Catholic Church, right? Because take the Assumption of Mary, for example. You see, even if someone were completely persuaded that Mary was assumed bodily into heaven, that doctrine contributes absolutely nothing to the gospel itself, right? It doesn't explain the gospel. It doesn't create the gospel. It doesn't preserve the gospel. It doesn't tell us how sinners are reconciled to God. And so no matter how you slice it, it simply is not operating on that same level that requires that Galatians chapter 1 anathema. And I think Father Pine kind of recognizes that to some extent. And I think that's ultimately why he places these doctrines in a secondary or even tertiary category. Now, again, to be clear, I don't even know that Protestants would place something like the Assumption of Mary in a secondary or tertiary category in the first place. Many of us would probably place it much further downstream than that, if even somewhere in the downstream at all. But for the sake of argument, let's simply accept Father Pine's categorization for just a moment. If the Assumption of Mary is actually a secondary or even tertiary doctrine, then our question as Protestants, and your question as Catholics too, should be, then why is it dogmatized in a way that binds the conscience of every believer, right? Why does rejecting a tertiary doctrine carry first order consequences? Why are doctrines that are admittedly downstream from the incarnation in the gospel treated as mandatory tests of full communion? You see, that's where I think this tension lies. And I think that actually brings us back to the first clip that we saw. Because once again, the issue is about authority. If Rome possesses the authority it claims to possess, then sure, Rome can define doctrines and bind consciousness accordingly, whether we understand the reasoning or not. But, and this is a very big but, if Rome does not possess that authority, then we would need evidence that these doctrines are genuinely apostolic before they can be imposed upon unbelievers. And my friends, it is not our fault if you don't have it. Okay? We would never look to Mormons and say that, hey, what evidence do you have that Joseph Smith is the new apostle or prophet or whatever the case may be? And if their evidence is slim to none, right, we would not accept them telling us, oh, well, you're just being skeptical. Why don't you just accept the authority that Christ and God, established through Joseph Smith? We would be like, what are you talking about? The bar for your claim is really high. And so if you don't have the evidence to substantiate that kind of claim, that's not on us for rejecting your heretical system. That's on you to substantiate why your heretical system is not heretical in the first place. And my friends, that's exactly why I found these two clips so fascinating. And again, it's not because Father Pine somehow refuted Catholicism, and it's not because Gavin somehow won a discussion. I don't think any of that happened here, but it's because these two moments expose what I believe to be the real disagreement between Catholics and Protestants, and even a little bit more related Orthodox. You see, the real disagreement isn't ultimately about Mary. The real disagreement isn't ultimately about icons or even the papacy, for example. The real disagreement is over authority. Who gets to determine whether a doctrine is a legitimate development or an illegitimate innovation? Rome says the church does. Protestants say that the doctrine must demonstrate its apostolic origin before it can bind the conscience of every believer. And I think once you can understand that, so many Catholic and Protestant debates suddenly become much easier to understand, because at the end of the day, again, we're not merely debating Mary. We're not merely debating the papacy. We're not merely debating saints. If the anathemas weren't attached to these things, you would probably find a lot more Protestants maybe having a bit more agreement on some things, or there still will be a lot of major disagreements, but you will see the tensions kind of dissipate, is what I'm saying. Because, now those doctrines aren't attached to such significant importance, such gospel level importance. And so again, we're not merely debating all of those things. What we're debating is the question that's underneath all of those questions, which is, what authority has Christ actually given his church, right? And I think until that question is ultimately settled, every other debate is ultimately just downstream from it. But all right, guys, that's the video. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. I love to hear from both my Catholic and Protestant listeners on this, because I think it's conversations like this that help us understand where our true disagreements lie. And as always, if you found the video helpful, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do all of that good stuff, as it helps the channel out a lot. But until next time, guys, peace.